Hello, my name is Arthur D'Amato, and this is a short presentation from what I had given at the Midwest Risk Management Symposium a couple of years ago. This is a lecture on physical preparedness for wilderness context, and this is meant to be a short instructional guide for wilderness guides, for outdoor athletes, for organizations like NOLS, Outward Bound, and the YMCA, groups that have wilderness tripping as part of their programs to, one, deal with the fact that we have a challenge in America with our levels of physical activity, which if our physical activity is getting lower and lower and lower, especially with younger adults and with children, and we're doing these outdoor expeditions in remote locations, it increases the likelihood of injuries in paddling sports for the shoulder, low back, the wrist, hand, and elbow, in rock climbing, finger, shoulders, and ankle injuries, and backpacking for the ankles and knees. In fact, national parks and state parks, the number one cause of injury are trips and falls, with the ankle joint being the most injured part of the body. And the hope is that with this kind of a lecture, it'll give outdoor professionals a resource for developing programs at their facilities that will help prepare young adults or even older adults to come into the wilderness tripping organizations healthy, to maintain their health while they are out there on the woods, and then maybe even to provide some carryover for when they're back home to maintain a healthy lifestyle. Now, putting together a strength and conditioning program is for injury prevention and performance enhancement. If we want to reduce the likelihood of low back pain, shoulder impingement, overuse injuries, we want to increase people's aerobic capacity, we want to increase their ability to create force, and we want to focus in on activity-specific strength with the side benefit of increased mental focus and endurance. Now, the interventions that we can use can be done before, during, or after our trips, and I'll be going through different examples of what we could be doing before, during, and after, and I have my own full templates and things that I sell and will, use consulting when I work with clients. Now, if you're going to do implementation at the level of an organization, I kind of recommend this being the 3 ways you go about it. So first step would be developing testing protocols at your program to see what is happening with your participants when they arrive at the trip, and then also when they get done with the trip. So you would have an A/B testing, You have potentially an intent to publish. You might take advantage of research grants. It's going to increase the amount of scientific literature around wilderness tripping in general and provide a rationale for why parents or why adults should be coming into these wilderness tripping programs for more than just the sights, sounds, of views, and so on. And then after that, you would want to take a look at just incorporating warming up and cooling down protocols into the tripping. I mean, something that is going to require staff endorsement. It's going to require being consistent and being standardized and actually getting people to take them seriously. If staff don't buy into something like warming up and cooling down with consistent results, you don't get consistent results. And then after that, you can start doing pre-trip training and then maybe exercise that you would have developed for the trips themselves for rehabilitation. So you would collaborate with either an exercise physiologist or a strength and conditioning coach, maybe incorporate web-based apps or have someone design programs that are accessible through Google Drive, where those programs are going to be in the hands of the participants, and there's going to be monitoring of their exercise routines before they get to the summer camp, and then monitoring during the trips as well. Now, the kind of testing that we want to have is going to provide evidence of the program's efficacy. If you have a trip and the participants show up and they are in the 35th percentile, and then they end the trip and they're in the 85th percentile of aerobic endurance, that means that you have a tangible benefit that you can send people home with. You can say, you are now healthier after this trip than you were beforehand. It also might establish things that the program needs. It might let you know, like, hey, we have a ton of injuries to the ankle joint. If we're now starting to keep track of how many injuries we have to the ankle joint and they're all sprain injuries, we need to develop programs that increase the strength of the ankle joint for our participants before they get here. You could also track physical change for different participants over time, just to see what the trips are doing for them. And you might have a bonus with advertising an insurance program. Now, the 5 types of tests that I would generally recommend that are easy to implement and require very little equipment are going to be aerobic capacity tests, where you measure the volume of oxygen that someone is able to consume. You want to measure body composition. You want to measure joint specific flexibility. So sit and reach boxes for low back and hamstrings, maybe a functional movement screen that would be a little more complex. And then muscular endurance and strength. So probably just push up and curl up tests. We need them to be standardized. And, it's very easy to move large groups of people through these kinds of tests with high reliability, even if it's just the participants doing the testing themselves, as long as the instructions are very clear for how you do the measurements. Pre-trip preparation, the minimum amount of time that you would want to have someone starting an exercise regimen before a trip is 4 weeks, before you start to see significant results in their training regimen. So generally, wilderness tripping is all about endurance activities, so that's what you would want to focus in on. You want to focus on the aerobic glycolytic system. You don't want to focus in on anaerobic training necessarily, and you want to focus in on specific muscle groups used for the activities that you're using. Progressions that you would probably want to use are that you start with low volume and move to high volume. So go from, say, 2 sets of an exercise to 3 sets, 4 sets, 5 sets, or go from 8 repetitions of an exercise to 10, 12, 15, or up the weights. You might also go from high volume, low intensity to low volume, high intensity. That's another way of saying, like, you start with maybe 3 sets of 10 with a low weight, and then eventually you would go to 3 sets of 5 with a much higher weight. That's another way of doing it. You could also focus in on doing rehabilitation, where you're going from stable surfaces and equipment that people are training with to unstable surfaces. That's going to force them to use more of their core. It's going to force them to use more of the stabilizing muscles, shoulders and hips. You could also go from high rest periods of 2 minutes or 3 minutes to low rest periods all the way down to 30 seconds, or from simple activities like a bicep curl to complex exercises like a pull-up or rows. And so the minimum number of days that you would want to be training in a week are going to be 2. The more that you train, the more responses that you get. Now, while you're out in the wilderness, you want to have standardized warm-ups that are dynamic stretching based. Muscles through full ranges of motion, joints through full ranges of motion. You want to avoid static stretching while you are doing your warming up, because generally you see higher incidences of injury when you do static stretching before exercise. You save the static stretching for your cool downs, and that's when you're going to be doing your toe touches. You would hold a static stretch for at least 30 seconds. If you hold a static stretch for 10 seconds, you don't get a whole lot of benefit out of it. You might also include myofascial release, something similar to foam rolling, which can be done with, say, a Nalgene bottle or other tools that you have with you. You could also incorporate prehab, so body weight exercises. You could bring exercise bands, and you can bring what are called occlusion straps. I'll spend more time on those later. And these would be corrective exercises to improve strength, stability, and endurance. Now, the workouts on the trail, working large muscle groups not used during your mechanism of travel. You can incorporate partner exercises for fun. Generally, the type of programs that you would want to incorporate are concurrent programs. A concurrent program is when you do strength training and endurance training on the same days. Now, the downside of concurrent training is that you can risk something called an interference effect, which is where if you mix and match your strength and endurance training inappropriately, you get conflicting results where you depress the results that you would want to get. Now, that's because you can have peripheral and central adaptations for both strength and endurance. Peripheral adaptations are what happens in the muscle. Central adaptations are what happens in the brain and the spinal cord. So generally, the best recommendations are you do peripheral strength and central endurance, or you do central strength and peripheral endurance. You can see the generalized set and rep range that you would use here. Now, for youth, training to a failure is completely unnecessary to get you ready for these types of trips. If you're going to add resistance training into a routine, you would do it 2 to 3 times a week, probably total body. if not having an emphasis on either lower or upper based on the activities. And then aerobic training, you'd want to shoot for 180 to 300 minutes a week. If you're doing a warm-up for backpacking, for instance, you would have a general phase. You increase the core body temperature until you're starting to sweat. Dynamic phases, when you take the joints to full ranges of motion, each rep should be 2 to 5 seconds per rep, 10 to 20 reps per exercise. And then you want to mimic the actions of the discipline, and that's best for the brain and spinal cord. So if you were kayaking, for instance, you could practice rolls during that warm-up section. Or if it's for backpacking, you could do some step-up. The fun thing that I think would be great to add into your training during trips, for instance, is this occlusion training. There's a lot of interesting exercise research being published about it. It's a low-intensity way of mimicking high-intensity exercise. So you could be a novice. You don't want to be sore after a workout. You do occlusion training. It maintains or increases strength and muscle mass. There's almost no delayed onset muscle soreness, or the DOMS. And the exercise recommendations, according to these researchers, are you would do 3 to 6 sets of 15 repetitions, 30 seconds or less for rest, and you would progress from doing single joint exercises to multi-joint exercises. And if you were doing it for cardio, you could walk for 2 minutes, rest for 2 minutes. And they're super lightweight, like exercise bands. You can just throw them right into a backpack, right into the hull of a canoe or a kayak, and they can be reused over and over and over again. Another very interesting area of research that's coming out that I am very excited about is cold training. Most people do not get a lot of exposure to cold temperatures because of the fact that, one, we have indoor heat, we have air conditioning, we can control the temperatures of our homes as much as we want, and we can layer up as much as we want. But if you do repeated exposures to cold temperatures, it affects your fat cells, similar to how aerobic exercises impact skeletal muscle. It increases the amount of mitochondria in the cell, and that makes it more efficient at using fat for energy. And one of the things that's very interesting is that if you have, when you have fat cells called adipose tissue, then normally they're white, but if you do cold training, you can increase how much energy they burn, the thermogenesis, and by increasing that mitochondria, the white adipose tissue changes color and becomes more beige. And so cold training is something where I think you're going to see a lot more research coming into play, and something that I think would be very interesting for wilderness organizations to start doing on their own time. The classic example of the guy who's doing it the most right now is this gentleman. This is Wim Hof, who's developed a series of techniques and holds a bunch of different records for cold adaptations and for cold training, including running around Mount Everest in a marathon with just a pair of flip-flops, running in Finland in negative 20 degree Fahrenheit weather in just shorts. And it's a very interesting line of research, and I would like to see more of where that's going to go. Now, in summary, outdoor recreation is facing a demographic challenge that could impact enrollment and increase injury risks. Organizations can take steps to reduce those injury risks for participants through exercise interventions. You do a pre-trip with 4 to 12-week exercise training regimens on the trip with either occlusion training, straps, warm-ups, cool-downs, and then post-trip, you could just give them resources for continuing their fitness that they gained while on the trail. These interventions add value to the experience of the participants, the staff, the organization, and that's independent of the injury risk, which can save organizations hundreds of thousands of dollars every year just by stopping injuries from occurring. Now, here are some of the sources that I used in my presentation here when I went to the symposium. And if there's any questions, I would love to try and answer them. If you could post them down in the comments, I would be super grateful. And thank you all for watching this presentation. And I hope to be able to give it in person sometime after COVID. Thank you.